Hi, this is Jeff Helgeson at Heirloom Books in Chicago, Illinois at 6239 North Clark Street. The text I'm talking about today, a bestseller from the Middle Ages, The Romance of the Rose, is the product of two different 13th century authors who were separated in time by about 40 years. The initial section of the work, around 4,000 lines of verse, was written by Guillaume de Laurent sometime between 1225 and 1230. It's an allegorical poem which was later translated into Middle English by Geoffrey Chaucer, dealing with the idealized concept of courtly love, an all-consuming attraction for a seemingly unattainable object of affection. Aside from his authorship of this poem, however, essentially nothing else is known about the writer. The life of the second author, Jean Dumas, who completed the project sometime around 1270, is really only slightly better chronicled, largely due to his having translated major Roman works about philosophy and warfare from Latin, in addition to the letters exchanged a century earlier between Eloise and Abelard, a medieval female student and her professor, who stayed in contact with one another over a large number of years once they had each devoted themselves to the church, after her family had become aware of the intimate nature of the relationship that had come to exist between them, and apparently in the name of honor arranged to have the young woman's scholarly mentor castrated. As for the Romance of the Rose itself, I should add that, as the work has come to currently exist, it provides both a scaffold for the abstract ideas of the second author and a reflection of a literary trend which had its origins in the oral tradition of French medieval troubadours, largely thanks to a number of concepts regarding women that these Provençal poets seem to have derived from exposure to the influence of other traveling musicians who had come from Muslim Spain. Unlike the traditional Hebraic Christian view of women as temptresses responsible for bringing suffering into the world, a view which had emerged from Persian influences within Islamic culture, placed women in the role of inspiring love for its own sake. And it's this type of idealization that is at the center of both Romance of the Rose and other medieval writings such as De Amour by Andreas Capellanus, presumably written at the request of Marie de Champon, the daughter of Ellen of Aquitaine with Louis VII of France, who once took his wife on crusade in the Holy Land, where she and her handmaidens allegedly rode bare-breasted to Damascus prior to their divorce in 1152, and her subsequent remarriage to an 11-year younger third cousin, the Duke of Normandy, who later became King Henry II of England and indirectly incited the murder of Sir Thomas à Becket, thereby causing Canterbury to become a pilgrimage location for the work of Geoffrey Chaucer, although Henry eventually had Eleanor imprisoned after she had supported the rebellion of one of their sons, as all examined in James Goldman's stage play and motion picture, The Lion in Winter, featuring Peter O'Toole and Katharine Hepburn, along with Anthony Hopkins and the one-time James Bond actor Timothy Dalton. But I digress. In summary, the poem, The Romance of the Rose, is presented as a dream that a man, Armand, the lover, claims to have had some 4 or 5 years earlier, when he was about 20, during the lusty month of May, as Alan Lerner and Frederick Lowe characterized it in their courtly love-based 1960 Broadway musical, Camelot. Within the dream, as he describes it, Armand, the narrator, walks along the bank of a river and discovers a high wall surrounding a beautiful garden. On the wall, there are various paintings depicting such things as envy, old age, avarice, and poverty. And then, coming to a small gate, a young woman who introduces herself as Lady Idleness lets the narrator inside and explains to him that the garden is owned by someone who she says is named Pleasure, to whom the dreamer is quickly introduced. He is then invited by Courtesy to join in a dance with several others, accompanied by a host of birds, all singing beautifully together. Exploring the garden further, the spring of love is discovered, the place where Narcissus had once become infatuated with his own reflection, eventually pining away and dying of unrequited love. Beneath the surface of the pool, there are two crystals that reflect the garden, and in one of them, the young man sees the image of a rose. Just as Cupid, the god of love, shoots him with 5 arrows. Taken prisoner, the narrator pledges his devotion to Cupid and is provided with the gift of hope, as well as pleasant thoughts, conversation, and appearance before Fair Welcome, the son of Courtesy, approaches and allows the lover, like the prince in Sleeping Beauty, to press through a bank of hedge and take a leaf from the rose before being driven back by a peasant named Rebuff. Reason suggests that the lover should give up his desire, but her advice is rejected. And with the help of Venus, Cupid's mother, Fair Welcome is persuaded to let the young man kiss the rose, provoking Jealousy to erect an enclosure within which both the rose and Fair Welcome become imprisoned, being guarded by an old woman. It's at this point that the first writer, Gilnu, ends his narrative and Jean Demus takes over, having Reason return and ask the lover to accept her as his mistress, only to once again be rejected. Friend suggests that, for the lover to fulfill his desire, he might try deception, bribery, and violence, although strongly warning against marriage. Rejected by Wealth, thereby being denied the use of lavish giving to obtain his goal, the lover contemplates trying otherwise to approach the guardians of the rose. But then the god of love comes back, bringing a troop of barons as allies to attack the castle of Jealousy. The old woman is captured and allows the lover to approach his obscure object of desire. But once again, he is driven away, this time by fear and shame. It's at this point in the story that Venus returns, and with her son, Cupid, she pledges to overcome chastity. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the garden, nature is working to maintain and encourage the development of life. She enlists her priest, Genius, to provide a sermon advocating sexual intercourse as both a natural and a necessary act in order to sustain existence. Now, once the attackers resume their assault, Venus succeeds in shooting a flaming arrow through a narrow passage, thereby setting the castle of Jealousy on fire, and it is quickly abandoned by fear and shame, and finally, after all this effort, to briefly paraphrase, the lover gains the chance to come to the beautiful rose, the long-standing object of his passionate desire, and is fully able to satisfy himself, gaining unfettered access to its open blossom, totally unrestrained other than by fair welcome's caution that he should in no way do any harm to the softening, blushing redness on the bush as he seeks to gratify the fervor of his will, gently taking hold of the long, longed-for bloom. The lover draws it toward him, deeply inhaling the rich sweetness of its fragrance, firmly drawing it to him, clasping his yielding beloved with both hands while carefully avoiding the potential threat of any thorn in order to explore the inside of the rosebud, a delicate membrane breaking away beneath the probing penetration of his intimate caress, a little seed scattering into its innermost depths. As the flower swelled and expanded under his touch, the lover inhaled its sweetness, finally plucking the flower with a deep sigh of ecstatic release. Fulfilling his desire in this way, the lover thanks his benefactors between a delicious series of kisses, and that is when the dreamer awakes to find that dawn had come. Morning had broken like the first morning. Blackbird had spoken like the first bird. Now, both authors, Guillaume and Jean, had promised to provide an explanation of everything they presented within the poem, but neither of them did. Consequently, the task of interpretation has fallen entirely upon the reader, and the range of responses has been very broad indeed. Barbara Tuchman, in A Distant Mirror, the calamitous 14th century, claims that the Romance of the Rose, on one hand, was seen as a monumental Bible of love, and on the other, denounced from the pulpit as pernicious and immoral. This literary work essentially divided European culture between its defenders and its critics. Humanists, Tuchman states, rallied around the poem's free-ranging thought and bold attack on standard formulas, to the extent that they would rather do without their shirts than this book. One even argued that the female vulva represented by the rose, according to the Gospel of St. Luke, was sacred. Another stating, I'll read it with my glasses this time, the more I study the gravity of the mysteries and the mystery of the gravity of this profound and famous work, the more I am astonished at its disapproval. Counterpoint to this perspective, however, reached all the way back to St. Augustine's Confessions from 397 CE and the rejection of pleasure for its own sake, in contrast to the notions expressed by Epicurus through Lucretius and in his poem on the nature of things from 3 centuries earlier. The prevailing opinion for 1,000 years, which the 21,780 lines of the Romance of the Rose came up against, was that copulation for pleasure rather than merely to ensure the survival of the species was inherently evil. Contrast, as expressed in 1399 by Christine de Paysan in her epistle to the God of Love, was essentially that which existed between Eve, the world's first sinner, and Mary of Nazareth, the Virgin Mother of Jesus, full of grace and blessed among women. And so here we are again with the Romance of the Rose, back in a lush prelapsarian garden where one relaxes on the axis of the wheel of life to get a feel of life, as Billy Strayhorn would so nicely express it in his 1949 song, Lush Life, surrounded by beauty and sensual delights, along with the heavenly song of birds, while critical doctrine would hold that beneath all this superficial beauty is the corruption of sin, its wages being death and eternal damnation, all just hidden away beneath a veneer of a thin facade within an entirely temporal, artificial garden of earthly delights. The argument offered up by genius, in fact, that consensual sex was not a sin, was declared a heresy in 1377. 1277, a century earlier. I must correct myself. One clergyman claiming that the Romance of the Rose glorified debauchery and degraded women, asserting that if he had the only copy of the work in the world, regardless of its monetary value, he would throw it into the fire, good people, into the fire, even though, according to Barbara Tuchman, in one interpretation of the text, the rose was transformed into an allegory for Jesus. Such thoughts notwithstanding, using our approach of context, content, and craft, as well as considering manifest and latent analysis in terms of literal, moral, psychological, and symbolic levels of expression, what one is left with is the need to form one's own conclusions. For me, a literal assessment of the action as being intended to mean what is presented in and of itself can fairly easily be set aside. I feel there must be something other than merely presenting the actions described as the intent within the poem. On a moral level, there seems to be more to consider, such as the rose being completely objectified as a passive recipient of male attention. And then there is the temptation of a psychological dream analysis, the kind of assessment that Kenneth Burke offers in Philosophy of Literary Form when he observes, if we try to discover what the poem is doing for the poet, we may discover a set of generalizations as to what it does for everyone. But then there is Sigmund, author of The Interpretation of Dreams, Freud's cautionary comment in Character and Culture that before the problems of the creative artist, analysis, alas, must lay down its arms. Clearly, it seems to me that there is libidinal energy at the base of the Romance of the Rose. And there's also what Freud describes in his essay, The Relation of the Poet to Daydreaming, as the true enjoyment of literature proceeding from the release of tension in our minds. There's also what might be described as the conscious intentions of a poet with respect to what a work conveys, combined with the opportunistic aspects of its composition, which need to be taken into account. For Guillaume de Laurent, the first poet of the Romance of the Rose, I think the intent was to create an allegory account of the general pattern of sexual attraction through the use of vivid imagery beyond the filter of relating a remembered dream. His interest, I believe, was in reflecting the secular values of his time in a way that was in keeping with such contemporaneous 11th and 12th century works as the Romance of Tristan and Isolde, and the poems that became the source of the material used by Karl Orff in his 1936 oratorio Carmina Burana, written by students in monastery schools, satirizing the Catholic Church and criticizing it for its materialism, while describing the seduction of females by knights and students and clergymen. For Jean de Meaux, however, in the scholastic tradition of Peter Abelard, Duns with his famous cap Scotus, the philosopher, not the Supreme Court of the United States, and William of Ockham with his logical razor, what I think was the intention in continuing the earlier poem was to play devil's advocate and both offer didactic, reasoned arguments and demonstrate how they can be rejected because of the innate power of life force, allowing for a demonstration of the consummation of the idea of courtly love through what the introduction to the Oxford Prose translation by Francis Horgan calls euphemistic fornication. Next time, it's a different take on undying love from the fully Christian standpoint of Dante Alighieri with the Divine Comedy. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street, Chicago, Illinois, and is open from noon until 7 o'clock in the evening, 7 days a week. And I'm Jeff Helgeson.